November 12, 1887. The town of Providence, nestled in a high mountain valley, was holding its breath. A quiet, collective tension had settled over the community, as tangible as the early frost that now silvered every rooftop and fence post in the mornings. The weekly supply train from the Eastern Territories was late. At first, it was a nuisance, a topic of mild complaint at Haverford's Mercantile, where men gathered around the pot-bellied stove. But 1 week had bled into 2, and now, entering the 3rd, the complaints had withered into a stony, anxious silence. The shelves in Mr. Haverford's store, once a proud testament to progress with their colourful tins and neatly stacked crates, were beginning to look skeletal. The sacks of flour were down to the dusty dregs. The great barrels of salt and sugar were almost empty, their contents scraped from the wooden sides. Coffee, the lifeblood of cold mornings, was being rationed by the bean. Every face in town seemed to carry the same pinched expression, a mask of forced nonchalance barely concealing a growing dread. The railroad company had sent no word, the telegraph lines were silent, a common enough occurrence when the first heavy snows began to fall in the high passes, but never for this long. Winter had arrived not as a gentle guest, but as a sudden tyrant, locking the valley in its icy grip weeks ahead of schedule. And with it came the chilling realization that their lifeline, the thin steel thread connecting them to the rest of the world, might have been severed. 10 miles outside of town, where the valley floor gave way to rolling foothills, the rancher Amos felt the same cold air, but it did not carry the same scent of fear. He stood before a low, heavy door of reinforced timber, set almost flush into a grassy mound behind his small, well-kept cabin. There was no grandiosity to it, just the plain, functional look of something built to endure. He turned a heavy iron key in the lock, the sound a solid, satisfying clank in the vast stillness. The door swung inward, revealing not darkness, but a set of steep, stone-lined steps leading down into the earth. A lantern hanging just inside cast a warm, steady glow on the contents of the subterranean room he had dug and built with his own hands over 2 long years. The air that rose to meet him was cool and dry, smelling faintly of earth, stone, and something else, the sweet, concentrated perfume of preserved abundance, a stark and defiant contrast to the creeping emptiness that was slowly strangling the town of Providence. The interior of the root cellar was a masterwork of quiet, determined industry. It was not a hoard, but an archive of sustenance, a library of calories meticulously catalogued and stored against a future of want. The stone walls, which Amos had painstakingly fitted together, sweated a cool dampness that kept the root vegetables firm and crisp in their wooden bins, potatoes, carrots, and turnips, all buried in clean sand. Hams and sides of bacon, cured with salt and smoke, hung from thick overhead beams, each wrapped in cheesecloth. On endless shelves that lined the perimeter sat hundreds of glass jars, their contents glowing like jewels in the lantern light. There were preserved beans, pickled cucumbers, and jams made from wild berries. But the centerpiece, the project that had earned him so much public derision, occupied the entire back wall. Great, airy sacks and wooden trays were piled high with dried fruit, a staggering 500 pounds of it. There were leathery rings of apple, their scent sharp and cidery, translucent, amber-colored slices of pear, and the dark, wrinkled skins of plums, their sweetness so concentrated they were almost like candy. To understand this monumental effort, you would have to go back to the previous summer, the first one Amos had faced since his wife, Martha, had passed. The grief was a physical weight, a constant, silent companion. But Martha had left him more than just sorrow, she had left him the habits of a lifetime. Her voice was a constant echo in his mind, especially in the orchard she had so lovingly tended. A full pantry is a quiet mind, Amos, she would say, her hands busy snapping beans or peeling peaches. You can't control the snows, but you can control what's on your shelves, and so, he had worked. From dawn until dusk, he channeled his loss into labor. He harvested every last piece of fruit from their small but prolific orchard, his hands moving with the steady, practiced rhythm of a man who had done such work for decades. He built long drying racks from scrap lumber and stretched cheesecloth over them, laying out the sliced fruit under the relentless glare of the summer sun. The sheer volume of it was immense, a testament to a season of perfect sun and gentle rain. He worked not for profit, not for praise, but as an act of devotion, a final, silent conversation with the woman who had been the bedrock of his life. Each piece of dried fruit was a memory, a testament to her wisdom, a bulwark against the encroaching silence of his empty home. That same summer, before the town's mood had curdled into anxiety, it had been one of smug confidence, and Amos's project was seen not as prudent, but as peculiar, even backwards. He had tried to share his bounty, loading his buckboard with crates of fresh, perfect apples and plums and taking them into Providence. He offered them for a pittance, thinking to help his neighbors stock up. He found his first and most formidable obstacle in Mr. Haverford, proprietor of the mercantile and the town's self-appointed arbiter of progress. Haverford, a man whose vest was always tightly buttoned and whose opinions were always loudly stated, looked at Amos's fruit with unconcealed disdain. "Fresh fruit? Amos, my good man, the train is due on Tuesday," he announced to the small crowd gathered in his store. "It's bringing in a whole consignment of canned peaches from Philadelphia. Sealed in syrup, clean, modern. Why would anyone trouble themselves with drying and storing when they can have the very best, ready to eat, from back east?" He patted one of the few remaining tins on his shelf as if it were a holy relic. The sentiment was quickly amplified by Mrs. Gable, a woman whose social standing was built on her sharp tongue and her enthusiastic adoption of every new fashion the mail-order catalogues offered. Seeing Amos buy his buckboard, she let out a theatrical laugh. "Oh, look, everyone! Mr. Amos is preparing for the Dark Ages. Are you expecting the railroad to just disappear?" Her laughter was a signal, and others, eager to align themselves with the town's influential voices, joined in. The mockery was gentle at first, then grew more pointed. Men would tip their hats to him with a wry smile and ask, "Stocking up for a long winter, Amos?" The question was never genuine, it was a joke at his expense. He became a local curiosity, the eccentric old widower who preferred the toil of the past to the convenience of the present. They saw his sweat-stained shirt and calloused hands not as signs of virtuous labor, but as evidence of his refusal to join the modern world, a world where everything you could ever need was just a train ride away. Amos never argued or defended himself. He simply nodded, sold what little he could to the few who would buy, and returned to his ranch, the quiet wisdom of his late wife a far more compelling voice than the chorus of ridicule from the town. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that steel rails and steam engines were still subject to the whims of rock, ice, and snow. Progress was a fine thing, but it was a fragile one. By the first week of December, the jokes had long since died in the frozen air. The early snows had been followed by a blizzard of historic proportions, a relentless 3-day storm that buried the valley under a thick, silent blanket of white. A rider who had attempted to get through the high pass had returned, half-frozen and defeated, with the definitive news: a massive rock slide, triggered by the freeze and thaw, had completely obliterated a 2-mile stretch of the railway tracks. The damage was catastrophic. There would be no train until the spring thaw, if they were lucky. The news spread through Providence not like a fire, but like a creeping frost, chilling every home and every heart. The town's cheerful confidence shattered, replaced by a raw, primal fear. Suddenly, the world had shrunk to the confines of their isolated valley. Haverford's mercantile was now a hollow monument to misplaced faith, its empty shells gathering dust. The forced smiles of a few weeks prior had dissolved into haggard, worried frowns. You could see the desperation etched onto the faces of parents as they looked at their children, their minds frantically calculating how to stretch their dwindling supplies. The baker's shop was shuttered, a handwritten sign on the door simply reading, "No flour." The saloon, usually a hub of boisterous activity, was quiet and somber, men nursing their drinks in a way that suggested they were conserving them. The fabric of the community, woven with the assumption of endless supply, was beginning to unravel. Scarcity has a way of stripping away pretenses, of revealing the brittle foundations upon which people build their lives. For the people of Providence, that foundation had been the distant, unseen labor of others, delivered to them on a predictable schedule. Now, left to their own devices, they were discovering just how little they truly possessed. If you've ever had that sinking feeling, that realization that you've put your faith in a system that could fail, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because Amos's story is a powerful reminder of what comes next. Now, back to Providence, where the full weight of that failure was just beginning to be understood by a town that had forgotten the ancient, unforgiving laws of winter. The first official sign that the town's wall of pride was cracking came not in the form of a public plea, but as a quiet, solitary visitor to Amos's ranch. Dr. Maynard, a pragmatic man who had seen more than his share of hardship, made the long ride out from town, his horse struggling through the deep snow. He found Amos splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of his axe the only sound in the snow-muffled landscape. The doctor didn't waste time with pleasantries. His face was grim, his eyes tired. "Amos," he began, his voice low, "we have a problem. It's the children. And the old ones. Mrs. Gable's mother, the Hemphill boy, they're weak. The lack of variety in their diet is taking its toll. We're seeing the first signs of scurvy." He paused, letting the clinical severity of the word hang in the cold air. "I know what people said this summer. I know they laughed. I didn't, but I didn't speak up, either, which makes me just as guilty." He looked Amos directly in the eye, a clear, unvarnished appeal from one man of substance to another. "I'm not asking for a handout for the town. But for my patients, do you have anything? Anything with the sun still in it?" Amos stopped his work, leaning the axe against the chopping block. He studied the doctor for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. There was no hint of triumph in his expression, no flicker of "I told you so." There was only a deep, weary gravity. He had seen this coming, had played this very scene out in his mind 100 times. He nodded slowly. "Martha always said an apple a day was God's own medicine," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. He disappeared into the cabin and returned a few moments later with a small but heavy burlap sack. The doctor could smell the sweet, tangy scent of dried apples even through the thick weave of the bag. "This is for your patients," Amos stated. "Tell them to soak the pieces in hot water before they eat them. It'll soften them up." He refused any mention of payment. This was not commerce, it was an act of quiet mercy, a recognition that the most vulnerable should not have to pay for the foolishness of the strong. The doctor took the sack, his relief palpable. "Thank you, Amos. You don't know what this means," but Amos knew. He knew it was just the beginning. News in a small, isolated town travels faster than a winter wind. Dr. Maynard had been discreet, but the sight of him returning from Amos's ranch with a full sack was all the confirmation Providence needed. Hope, fragile and desperate, began to bloom in the frozen ground of their despair. Within 2 days, a small, hesitant crowd had gathered at the end of the long track leading to Amos's cabin. It was not a demanding mob, but a silent, humble delegation. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and laborious, their faces chapped by the wind, their eyes filled with a mixture of shame and supplication. They stood by his fence line, unsure of how to proceed, their earlier mockery now a bitter memory that held their tongues. Conspicuously absent were the town's 2 loudest critics, Mr. Haverford and Mrs. Gable, their pride clearly still too great a barrier to overcome. Amos emerged from his cabin, pulling on a heavy coat. He walked slowly toward the gate, his expression calm and resolute. He had been preparing for this moment just as surely as he had prepared the fruit. He looked over the faces of his neighbors, recognizing each one. He saw the worry for their families in the slump of their shoulders, the fear for their children in their downcast eyes. He did not offer pity, nor did he demand an apology. Instead, he offered a pact, grounded in the principles of dignity and mutual obligation. "I have enough to help," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "But I have no charity to give. Charity makes a man weak. Work makes him strong." He laid out his terms with simple, irrefutable logic. He would open his storehouse 2 days a week. Each family would receive a ration, carefully measured, based on the number of mouths they had to feed. In exchange, the able-bodied men would provide labor. His woodpile needed to be expanded to a size that could last 2 winters, not just one. His fences, battered by the blizzard, required mending. His livestock needed tending, their stalls mucked out, their water troughs kept free of ice. It was not punishment, it was a practical exchange. He was offering them not just food, but a way to earn it, to reclaim a measure of their self-respect. There was a long silence as the men looked at one another, the fairness and wisdom of the offer sinking in. Then, one by one, they nodded. They had come as beggars. Amos was ensuring they would leave as partners in their own survival. The system Amos established became the new rhythm of life in Providence. Every Tuesday and Friday morning, a quiet, orderly line would form at his ranch. Inside his small barn, which he had converted into a distribution center, a new kind of commerce took place. There was no currency exchanged, only a ledger in which Amos's steady hand recorded each family's name and the rations they received. The portions were exact. A scoop of dried apples, a handful of dried plums, a portion of cured meat, a few precious potatoes. It was enough to supplement the meager supplies of game meat the town's hunters could bring in, enough to stave off malnutrition and disease. The effect on the community's morale was immediate and profound. The men who had once leaned against the wall of Haverford's mercantile trading jokes now worked side by side in the sharp, clean air of Amos's property. The ring of their axes against wood became the town's new heartbeat. They repaired the fences with numb fingers, their shared labor forging a new, unspoken bond of respect. They were no longer just neighbors, they were a crew united by a common purpose. The women, in turn, organized themselves back in town. They established a communal kitchen in the church basement, pooling their rations to create nourishing stews and soups. They rediscovered old recipes, learning how to make the dried fruit stretch, how to use every last scrap. The sweet scent of rehydrating apples and plums simmering over a fire became a symbol of their collective endurance. The 500 pounds of fruit, once a subject of ridicule, was now the cornerstone of their survival. It was a tangible lesson in foresight, portioned out in small, life-sustaining increments. Amos oversaw the entire operation with a quiet, unwavering authority. He was not a king, but a steward, managing the precious resource he had created with wisdom and an unshakable sense of fairness. He was teaching them, without ever delivering a sermon, that a community is not built on what it can import, but on what it can produce and, most importantly, what it is willing to share in times of hardship. The winter was far from over, but for the first time since the snows had come, the people of Providence felt they had a fighting chance. As the weeks turned into months, and the brutal winter wore on, the town's social hierarchy was completely upended. The old metrics of status, the fine dress Mrs. Gable wore, the imported goods in Mr. Haverford's store, were now meaningless. The new currency was resilience, competence, and the willingness to contribute. It was in this transformed atmosphere that the town called a meeting, not out of crisis, but out of a deeply felt need for a moral reckoning. They gathered in the small, unheated church, their breath misting in the cold air. It was Mr. Haverford who stood up first, his usual booming confidence replaced by a somber humility. He walked to the front, turning to face his neighbors, his gaze eventually landing on Amos, who sat quietly in a back pew. "I owe this town an apology," Haverford began, his voice thick with emotion. "More than anyone, I owe one to Amos. For years, I've stood behind my counter and sold you all on the idea of progress. I told you that new was better, that distant was superior. I sold you tins and packages and promises of an easier life." He shook his head, a look of profound regret on his face. "I sneered at what was right in front of me. I valued a tin of peaches from a factory 1,000 miles away more than I valued the hard-won harvest of my own neighbor. I confused convenience with strength, and I led you all to do the same. We put our faith in iron rails, and we forgot the wisdom of the earth. Amos tried to show us, and I encouraged you to laugh. For that, I am truly sorry." He sat down to a heavy silence, his confession hanging in the air. Then, a second figure rose. It was Mrs. Gable, her fine clothes now looking worn and out of place. Her voice, usually so sharp and cutting, was soft and trembled slightly. "I was worse," she said, not looking for pity but stating a fact. "I made his hard work into a joke. I used my influence to make you all feel superior for being dependent. It was vanity. It was foolishness. My own mother is alive today because of the very fruit I mocked. There are no words to undo the shame of that." She looked directly at Amos, her eyes glistening. "Thank you, Amos. You saved us not only from starvation, but from our own arrogance." In that cold church, the truth was laid bare. Amos's vindication was complete, not because he demanded it, but because it was offered freely by those who had once been his most determined critics. When the spring thaw finally came, it felt like a miracle. The great, oppressive silence of the snow was broken by the sound of dripping water and the cheerful chirping of returning birds. Word eventually reached them that the pass was cleared, and one day in late April, the distant, lonely sound of a train whistle echoed through the valley for the first time in 5 months. The arrival of the supply train was a cause for celebration, but it was a celebration tempered by the hard lessons of the preceding winter. The town of Providence was not the same place it had been the autumn before. Mr. Haverford's first order was not for tin peaches or fancy goods from the East. Instead, he ordered seeds, canning jars, and books on food preservation. His mercantile was transformed. One entire wall was cleared to make way for a new section he called the Providence Larder. He started a program, working with local families to buy their surplus produce, creating a communal reserve model directly on Amos's storehouse. Never again, he vowed, would the town be so utterly dependent on a single, fragile lifeline. The social dynamics had shifted, too. Mrs. Gable, humbled by her experience, became a tireless organizer of the community kitchen, teaching younger women the preservation techniques she was now learning herself. The mockery and status-seeking that had once characterized the town's social life had been replaced by a spirit of cooperation and mutual respect. Amos, once the town eccentric, was now regarded as its wisest elder. He sought no official position, but his opinion was sought on everything from planting schedules to community planning. He had become the moral compass of a town that had lost its way and, through hardship, found it again. The 500 pounds of dried fruit had been more than just sustenance, it had been a catalyst. It had forced the people of Providence to look inward, to rediscover the timeless virtues of foresight, labor, and community. They had learned, in the most visceral way possible, that true security doesn't come from a distant factory, it is grown, harvested, and preserved by the hands of a prepared and united people. The empty shelves of one winter had taught them how to keep their shelves full for a lifetime. The following summer, the sun once again beat down on the valley, ripening the fruit in Amos's small orchard. But this year, he was not alone in his work. A handful of the town's young men and women came out to his ranch regularly, not as part of a work-for-food agreement, but as willing apprentices. He moved among the trees, his steps slower now but just as sure, showing them how to properly prune the branches to ensure a healthy harvest. He taught them how to recognize the precise moment of peak ripeness, a skill that couldn't be learned from any book. They helped him build new drying racks, their youthful energy a welcome addition to the quiet rhythm of his life. He shared with them not just his techniques, but his philosophy, the wisdom inherited from his wife, Martha. "The land gives you what you need," he told them one afternoon, holding a perfect, sun-warmed peach in his palm. "But it demands your attention in return. You have to listen to its seasons, not just your own appetites. A seed planted at the right time, a harvest brought in before the first frost, a portion set aside for a day you hope never comes, that's not just farming. That's a conversation with the future." He showed them the simple, elegant process of slicing the fruit, of laying it out on the racks, of turning it daily until it was perfectly preserved. He was passing on more than a skill, he was inoculating the next generation against the complacency that had nearly destroyed their parents. He was ensuring that the lesson of the long winter would not be a fleeting memory, but would become part of the town's permanent character. His legacy would not be a statue in the town square, but something far more vital, a community that understood the profound and enduring difference between wealth and resilience, between a life of ease and a life of substance. The final image of that season was a simple one, Amos, standing in his orchard, handing a freshly picked apple to a young girl, her face bright with a future that, thanks to him, was now built on a much more solid foundation.